Hello again, IB psychology students. As some of you may know who have seen my other videos, I always start with a shameless plug for the textbooks that I co-authored. Extremely user-friendly texts for you to use to help you in all your studies. Okay, so what we're looking at today is the internal assessment. This is the piece of work that you carry out on your own. It's 18 to 2,200 words. It is based on an experiment that you've carried out with a group, but you write it on your own. It is a very straightforward piece of work, but you can kind of fall off the side of a cliff if you don't really stick to the guidelines. That's what I always tell my students: stick to the guidelines and you'll be fine. And it's amazing how many of them don't. So I've put this video together to help you to get a good mark in your IA. If you are standard level, the IA is worth 25% of your overall mark in psychology. If you are higher level, it's worth 20%. So you really need to make this perfect. You need to get the most marks that you can possibly get, because it's not like an exam. It's not a one-off, one-shot chance to do your best. You have quite a few months to make this as good as you can. Okay, now with your introduction, if you don't state the aim of your IA very clearly, you won't get any marks for the introduction. So it's a really easy win. The aim of this IA is to investigate X and is a replication of Y. That's all you need to say. And then you expand on the theory. It might be serial position effect, for example, if you are looking at Glanzer and Kunitz, or another similar study. So you would link it to the multi-store model of memory. You would look at the serial position curve. You would use detail. You would use terminology. You wouldn't evaluate, and you don't need to bring in any other pieces of research. Just stick to the theory, expand on it, make it relevant what you're saying. Don't quote from textbooks that you've read. This is not an English essay. Just explain the theory. So what you would need to focus on then is the study you are replicating. Now, a lot of the studies that students replicate for their IA have lots of different parts to them that it's just not possible for students to replicate. This is why most IAs will be a partial replication. For example, if you are replicating Loftus and Palmer, it is a partial replication because you are not going to be doing their 5 conditions. You can only do 2 conditions of the independent variable, so they might be smashed and contacted, and you are not going to be replicating experiment 2 with the broken glass. So you need to pick out the parts of the original study that make sense to your replication. So you don't write thousands of words on Loftus and Palmer's 2 experiments and the procedure. You just focus on the fact that they had their 5 conditions, and these are the results that they had. They linked it to reconstructive memory of eyewitnesses, and you talk about the bits that are important to you, what the results were, what they concluded, but don't mention experiment 2. There's no need to mention experiment 2. It's not relevant. You're not going to get any more marks for it. But what you must do is then explain how you are partially or fully replicating it. So if you're doing Loftus and Palmer, you would say, well, we are partially replicating Loftus and Palmer because we are only testing 2 conditions of the independent variable. Some of my students make mistakes and they say there were 2 independent variables. No, there weren't 2 independent variables. There was 1 with 2 conditions. So make sure that's clear in your head. You cannot do it with 5 conditions. It has to be 2. Yeah, don't drive your poor teacher demented by saying, well, I want to do 5. You can't do it. Just do 2, okay? It's just too difficult with all the stats and everything, and it's just be told you can only do 2, okay? And what you really have to do here is explain how your study links back to the theory or the model that you are investigating so that your study makes sense. Right, I'm going to shut up for a minute. I'm going to let you pause the presentation and read this screen yourself. Okay, so you've read the last screen. Hopefully you've understood it. Now, you will not have many references in your IA, not like you will for your extended essay, depending on what subject you're doing for it. But you must reference anything you used in terms of reading matter, in terms of watching videos, anything that you used and accessed in completing your internal assessment. You must reference your original study. Now I'm going to upload a references section for you to see how you do this, but you have to have a references section. Don't use footnotes. They're not necessary in the IA. Just have a references section. So if you mention Loftus and Palmer 1974, I can go to your references section and I can see, there it is, properly referenced. Don't put it as a website reference. It must be referenced as a proper study in the proper format. But when you download my references video, you'll see that, and I'll link all of the IA videos below, so you can reference, you can access all of them. Okay, so the final part of your introduction is where you write your 2 hypotheses. Now, you get marked on your hypotheses. They must be operationalized. They must be a prediction written in the future tense, and they must just be 1 sentence long, quite a tall order. So you should decide whether your experimental hypothesis is going to be directional or non-directional. So this will come into play when you do your inferential statistics later on when you're analysing your results. So it's important, obviously, you choose one of them. Sometimes students try to write two different hypotheses in one. They'll make it directional and non-directional, which is very complicated and just doesn't work. So you just choose one. Now, if it's a directional hypothesis, you have predicted the direction of the difference. So, for example, participants who are given the verb smashed will blah, blah, blah. If it's non-directional, you predict a difference, but that's all you predict. There will be a difference in the speed estimates of participants who blah, blah, blah. You need to practice a little bit when you write hypotheses. It's got to be good because you are marked on them. Now, so you might want to do it this way, participants who, or there will be a difference. So we've got at the top a directional hypothesis, then a non-directional hypothesis, but label them experimental hypothesis. Don't put directional or non-directional. And you always have your null hypothesis. There will be no difference in, I would say, always, if you start with either of these 3 sentences, your hypotheses will work. Participants who, or there will be a difference for your experimental hypothesis. Null hypothesis, I always say to my students, start it, there will be no difference. Don't start it any other way. Hypotheses are easy if you keep it simple. They're difficult if you start getting tangled up in your own ideas. Now, for full marks on the introduction, you must operationalize both the independent variable and the dependent variable. So if you just put noise will affect the participants, that's not operationalized. For example, if you were operationalizing the IV of noise, that would be loud music or silence. And the dependent variable, well, memory is what you're measuring, but that's a bit vague. I would also want you to include what is being measured and how. For example, there will be a difference in the number of correctly recalled words out of 20. There is your operationalized dependent variable. Correctly recalled words out of 20. Depending on whether the participants recall the words, now here comes the IV, in the presence of loud music or in silence. That's a full mark experimental hypothesis there. And what you do to turn it into a null hypothesis, you take out a difference and you insert no difference. There will be no difference. Easy, easy peasy. So if you hate writing hypotheses, I would say always write a non-directional one, because it's easier to turn into a null hypothesis, unless there is a really good reason for writing it as a directional hypothesis. So I just had a look at this that the examiner had written. This is taken from the May 2019 internal assessment results. Now, I could have taken this examiner's report from any year, really. I've looked at quite a lot of them, and they pretty much always say the same thing. So students always make the same mistakes. You do not want to be one of those students. You want to be a student who, when the person marking your IA receives it, they think, thank heavens, somebody knows what they're doing. So this is what the examiner reported on. Some IAs, well, many, that surprised me. Many of the reports did not include a theory or model in the introduction. I mean, really? How on earth can you submit your IA without saying what theory or model you're testing? Seems crazy to me, but some people clearly did. Make sure that you're not one of them. Most reports included a detailed description of 2 or 3 studies, including the replicated study. Now, this is what used to be part of the old IA specification. Sadly, maybe some teachers have not realised that you don't need to do that anymore. You're not going to get any marks for that. You really don't need to do it. It's a waste of time. You're not going to get the examiner saying, wow, this kid's really good, let's give him extra marks. Ain't going to happen. Candidates also failed to link their own investigation back to the original theory or model. That's a big problem. It's got to be holistic. We got to know what your aim is and how your replication makes sense in terms of your aim. Now, the hypotheses were often not operationalized. So just what we've talked about, you need to really make your IV and DV clear from the way that you write them in the hypothesis. We need to be able to see what the IV consists of and how the DV is going to be measurable. So you can go back through this PowerPoint. You can turn my voice off if you're sick of listening to me, and really make sure that you know about how to write your introduction. And I'll just end on my books again. So if you feel you need a bit of structured guidance with all the studies for the core approaches and the options for the second year of your psychology course, look no further. Okay, and I will see you again, or you will hear me again on the other PowerPoints that link to the IA. Bye for now.